Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I hope everyone is well. We're happy to see everyone back for another session today. So before we begin, I want to invite one of our sisters to give us the opening invocation. Herma. I don't know if she's here. Sorry, I'm checking for Herma. I saw her and now I can't see her anymore. Okay, since Herma is not here, maybe one of the other sisters from Africa, Maria, I can see you. You could perhaps do the invocation today on behalf of Herma. Maria?
Thank you. Okay, my name is Maria from Kenya, and I will do the invocation. So it's another day, beautiful day that God has granted us. And I would like to pray in my local language, if it's okay. Okay, let's pray. Ashengai Papa, Tanapari, Ashete Ngolonino, Ashete Ntoki Pokening Joyo, Ashete Fimi, Tamayana Fimi, Tamayana Yo Pokin, Ashete Ngopang Sidaining Joyo, Tamayana Columbia University, Tamayana participants Pokin, Ashe Papalai, Ashe Tanapari, Joyo Ngeno, Joyo Ngishon, Ashe Papa. Thank you. Amen.
Thank you so much, Maria, for that opening. So today we're going to start a bit different before we introduce our special guest, who has been with us since the beginning, but is going to be speaking with us today. So before I invite Professor Elsa to begin, I want to invite all of you to introduce yourselves before we can begin, so that she can know who you are. And some of you also have not met the other participants, so that we can also know who you are. And so what we'll do is I will go. Well, I'll just use my screen so that it's faster. So I'll go with who I'm seeing on my screen first, and then we can continue to the end as the others also join in. So we'll start with you, Anima. So please introduce yourself. Tell us who you are, your indigenous peoples, where the country you're from, and the organization you're representing. So Anima, let's start with you.
Hi, this is Anima, and my last name is Debarma, and I'm representing India, and I'm from the state called Tripura, which is in Northeast, and I belong to the Tripuri community, the indigenous community of the state Tripura. Also, I'm actually working with the government of Tripura in education sector. However, also, I'm helping my indigenous people and representing the organization which is called Rajghat Nari Samiti. So we basically work with women groups, and the women group, we believe that financial independence is very important for women. So we are working in the livelihood sector to help the women so that they can be independent, because we believe that when we have money in our hands, then we can work together and we can support each other, even if they're single, or even if they are supporting their family as a man. So that is what I am here. I'm very happy to be here. I'm learning a lot of things. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anima. Just to remind everyone, please just introduce yourself, your name, your peoples, and your organization, and not to elaborate because of the interest of time. So please keep it as short as possible. Thank you. So we'll go to Doris Esteban next.
Hello, everyone. I'm Doris Esteban. I'm from the Philippines. I'm an Ibaloy, and I'm representing Tabtaba. Thank you.
Thank you, Doris. Lanari?
Buenos días a todas. Mi
Good
nombre
morning,
es
everyone. My name is Janeri Becker Carranza. I'm from the Indigenous peoples of Mosquito, and I belong to the La Payola Women's Group. Thank you.
Richa?
Richa?
Hi, my name is Richa Pradhan, and I'm from Nepal, and I belong to Newar community in Nepal, and I'm representing Network of Indigenous Women in Asia. Thank you.
Thank you. Elizabeth?
Hola, soy Elizabeth Olvera.
Hello, my name is Elizabeth Olvera. I am a Zapoteca from Oaxaca, Mexico, and I represent the National Network of Lawyers, Indigenous Lawyers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Siobhan? Oh, I think we lost Siobhan. Okay.
Oh,
Siobhan.
I apologize. My internet has been a little bit bad in my area, but anyways, I'm Shaban. I'm from Guam. I'm Indigenous Chamorro, and the organization I'm representing is Nihi and Protect Guam Water. Thank you. I apologize.
No worries. Thank you, Siobhan. Citlali?
Hola, mi nombre es Citlali.
Hello, my name is Citlali. I am from the indigenous community of Wirarica, and I belong to the Young Indigenous Women Network in Mexico.
Thank you, Citlali. Brittany? Brittany?
Good morning, sisters. My name is Bridani Marian Neverapasa. I am from Peru, and I come from the indigenous community of Zipita. I represent the Young Indigenous Network Aymara and the Continental Link of Indigenous Women of the Americas. Thank you.
Thank you, Brittany. Regina?
Good evening, everyone. I'm Regina from Indonesia. I'm representing Institute of Ecology. My main base is in Borneo Islands, which is West Kalimantan in Indonesia. Thank you.
Thank you, Regina. Metali?
Yes, good morning, sisters. Good afternoon and good evening. My name is Medalit Rivera Matera. I'm a young indigenous woman from Elave, specifically from the lake area, and also from the highlands, part of the highlands. I represent the organization Union of Young Indigenous People. It's called Elawila. It means young blood. And also the Continental Network of Indigenous Women of the Americas. Thank you.
Thank you, Melody. Maria?
Hello everyone, my name is Maria Letitoya from Kenya. I belong to the Samburu Indigenous community, and I work for African Indigenous Women Organization. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Herma? Herma? Okay, as we wait, Richard, did I call you? Not yet. Did I?
Already. Yeah.
Okay. I don't think I have left out anyone. Herma, I don't know if you can hear us. Okay, when she's back on, then maybe she can introduce herself. So thank you everyone for your introductions. Herma?
Hello. Good evening. Are you getting me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm Herma Rotuno from Kenya. I belong to Naramam Women Group in West Pokot County. Thank you.
Thank you, Herma. And with that, I think we've gotten everyone. If I've forgotten someone, please let me know, or you can just unmute yourself and introduce yourself in case I have not called you out. So again, thank you and welcome everyone to our session today. We're going to have a session. Fridays are our Columbia University sessions, and so today we are happy and excited to invite Professor Elsa, who has been a teacher, a friend, and ally for very, very many years, and we're always excited to have her in the school. And you know, we're very grateful that you're always opening your arms to share your knowledge and your experience, and especially in the Indigenous people's movement. And so today we will have a session with Professor Elsa, and she will be speaking to us. So before I tell you what she's going to be speaking to us about, I'm going to read her bio so that we can know a little bit more about her. And I'm sure that she's also going to, in her class today, she's going to tell us more about her experiences. And so Professor Elsa joined Columbia University in 2011 after a 31-year service at the United Nations, Vienna, Geneva, and New York, with some 22 years dedicated to human rights, in addition to 8 years exclusively devoted to Indigenous people's rights. Indigenous issues were part of her portfolio since 1983, and she became the first chief of the Secretariat of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues in 2003. In 2011, she taught the first ever course on Indigenous people's rights, the first course on the director of the Indigenous at the Institute of the Human at the Institute of the Study of Human Rights in Columbia University. This is since 2012. Her academic background is in law, international law, criminal justice, and political science. And she has worked on human rights, norm creation, institution building, the rights of Indigenous peoples and other groups, women's rights, cultural rights, development, and intergovernmental cooperation. She has worked closely with non-governmental organizations around the world and has received various awards, including the Ingrid Washino El Isa. Professor, you let us know how we can pronounce that particular name. Flying Eagle Woman Peace, Justice and Sovereignty Award, the award of the NGO Committee on the Decade of the World's Indigenous Peoples, the Eleanor Roosevelt Award on the Voices 21, the Innovation of Academia Award of Arts and Culture 2016 by the University of Kent. In 2016, she was featured in one of UN's 80 leading women from 1945 to 2016. She sits on various boards, including as co-chair of the International Commission on the Chittagong Hill Tracts and as a member of the board of IPIA. Professor also has also written a lot of articles, books, book chapters and books on a variety of human rights topics, including of Indigenous women, Indigenous peoples, and we will provide you with a list of those articles and chapters that she's in, and you can always read those when you're reading during your free time or when you're reading other materials so that you can gain more knowledge on that end. And so thank you so much, Professor Elsa, for making the time always to be with us. And we're very happy to have you again this year. And thank you for coming to speak with us and to our students this year. And so I'm going to leave the floor for you so that you can continue. And Professor Elsa is going to be talking to us about the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Movement and its achievement at the international level, including the achievements of Indigenous women. So welcome, Professor Elsa.
Thank you so much, Winnie. Thank you, Joy. Thank you for organizing us. And I want to thank all our sisters for being here, because it's a big responsibility for us when you give your precious time to FIMI, to Columbia University, to each one of us that share things. And I want to say, in response to what Winnie said, that it's not like that I am just teaching. You know, I'm learning every year from the group of Indigenous women leaders that you are. And it's a special time every year. And we look forward to it. And I personally look forward to it. It's very enriching for me. And I want to thank Maria also for today, for opening, with spiritual words, our meeting. And I want to ask Winnie whether your people have this PowerPoint accessible so that they can open it for me and start with the first image while I'm talking, if that is possible. So I wanted to start by saying that, of course, that Columbia University is on Lenape land. The Lenape are the original people of this area. And although today I'm not in New York, I am here at my daughter's house, upstate New York, which is also Lenape land here. Because yesterday was my granddaughter's 5th birthday. And as a woman, I am in various capacities, you know, a mom and a grandma and all that. So I wanted to say that for a long time, the Native American Council, which is the Native American Students Association at Columbia, made advocacy together with professors and workers, other employees at Columbia, for us to place a special sign on our grounds at Columbia that we recognize that this is the land on which the Lenape people, it was their original land, and that's where Columbia University is. And it says, the Lenape lived here before and during colonization of the Americas. This plaque recognizes these indigenous people of Manhattan, their displacement, dispossession, and continued presence. It stands as a reminder to reflect on our past as we contemplate our way forward. And the next step that we were able to make due to advocacy was to get Columbia University to recognize in October, the second Monday of October, as Indigenous Peoples Day and not Columbus Day. So it is Indigenous Peoples Day. That was, again, another step, you know, taken by the university as an official entity towards Indigenous issues. But at the same time, I want to say this: we can take off for them at the moment this piece, and I can continue telling you something else. So I wanted to say that the Columbia University is very proud that it has been able to teach human rights. It was the first university in 1971 to teach human rights at the university. And it took 40 years 40 years for Colombia to teach indigenous people's rights. When I came, you know, in 2011, I taught it for the first time. And so the question is, because obviously it's not just an Elsa or a Maria that make the difference. What brings an issue and makes it into a university issue? So I think that the story that I'm going to tell you, which is of course the creation by indigenous peoples of their own global movement and the achievements that they reached because of this movement, this is what has been pushing also academia to open its doors and its minds to indigenous issues. So I want to say that one July afternoon in 1981, when I had just joined the Human Rights Office of the United Nations in Geneva, the office quiet of very, you know, summery afternoon, hot, it was interrupted by the sound of drums coming from the yard surrounded by the buildings of the Palais des Nations, as is the name of the UN offices in Geneva, you know. And I leaned out of the window and I saw a procession of Indians dressed in their traditional clothes, marching ceremonially through the yard. And I noticed that in the very front of the procession were very old people who were leading the ceremony. They were walking slowly and with some difficulty. And the procession and the drumming lasted for some time. It was an extraordinary sight. And many UN staff, UN employees had come to their windows or went down to the yard to watch. And I was, as you can imagine, totally impressed and intrigued myself. And given my earlier interest in indigenous peoples' issues, I immediately decided to find out who these people were, why they were there at the UN, and whom they were seeing, etc. And I discovered, to my delight, that they were in fact targeting my own office, the UN Human Rights Office. And in a few hours, I found the colleague who was focal point for this. And it was the late Augusto Williamson Diaz, a Guatemalan political refugee, the first UN staff member to deal with indigenous people's rights at the United Nations, and who later became my mentor. So what I want to say today, and I was probably the age that some of you have, I was a young person, you know. It was my beginnings working in human rights at that time. So today I want to share the story and some explanation of how indigenous people's rights have become an issue of international concern. And I will apply, in order to present this to you, the methodologies and the approaches of the indigenous movement. I will not just come up with those by myself, but it is how indigenous peoples, one step after the other, did that. And I would like to ask our technicians from FIMI to bring us some photographs, because photographs speak many words. So can you please go back to my PowerPoint, my dear friends, and we go after to show some photographs. And as people put up the PowerPoint and the photographs, I want to say that these photographs, my friends, so we can go to point 2 now, to photograph 2. These photographs, slide 2, we can go, of my PowerPoint. They are from the 1977 meeting that was very significant. It was an anti-racism meeting that indigenous peoples decided to create a meeting to prepare for an anti-racism conference that the UN Human Rights Office was organizing. And it was a meeting especially of the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere at that time. So the images that you see here, they are in the yard of the United Nations. I just want to tell you, my friends, that these are similar, very similar to what I saw in 81, because 81 was the next time that people came, but they were more global at that time. So here is the Western Hemisphere, and you see they're coming in, they have their drums, they're singing, and this is the image I also saw in 1981. Next slide, please. Next slide. So you see people coming in, slowly holding their sacred staffs. And some of these leaders became extremely famous subsequently. Some have left us. They were the people who, you see they're young here, but you know, and you see the bottom, the bell bottoms as well. You can see that, the fashions, right? And some became extremely famous leaders subsequently. Next slide. Next slide, please. So here, all these leaders here, this is also what I saw from my window. They're coming into the yard. They are now in the yard. And the person on the right is Oren Lyons, Onondaga faith keeper of the Haudenosaunee. And Bill Means next to Oren Lyons. Okay, next slide, please. And here is, there is a globe in the, maybe the sister that has her, okay, she found it. In the office of Geneva, in the yards, in the gardens, there is a big globe, and people took their first photograph, a historic picture of 1977 when they were there. And since 1977, every time there are meetings, indigenous related meetings in Geneva, there is a photograph like this by the globe in, on UN grounds in Geneva that is taken by indigenous peoples. Next, please. Again, you see elders and others waiting to go inside. Next slide. Here they are in the conference room, and in that conference, I participated in the 81 conference when they came again. But in 1977, they spoke about their issues. It was historic meeting, as you can see, and they put the foundations, my friends, of the declaration of what became later, you know, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. They put together the basic principles that they wanted to see as human rights norms recognizing indigenous people's rights. Next, please. Next slide. Another wonderful photograph of people from Latin America, North America together. Next slide, please. And of course, indigenous youth, always very media savvy. Since that time, continue to be indigenous media, and in particular also indigenous youth involved in media. Next slide, please. Another one of people coming in ceremonially. Next slide. I think that will be the last one. Yes. So this is Mrs. Shenandoah, Audrey Shenandoah, who is from the Haudenosaunee, and she's a Mohawk, and she's showing us her passport. This is her Haudenosaunee passport. Haudenosaunee is the Six Nations Confederacy, and they claim that they are the first confederacy in the world, with a very strong also legal tradition among the nations that compose the confederacy. And among other things, they have their passport, and and she's showing it with great pride. And I just wanted to tell you that not only Switzerland accepted it in 1977, but by today 22 countries in the world accept the Haudenosaunee passport. So this is very symbolic, and that's why I want to share it. So for now, I want us to leave this PowerPoint. We'll come back to it later. And I wanted to say, tell a story, because, you know, the narrative and remembering the story and sharing it from an indigenous perspective is extremely important for us today, not just for yesterday, but for today and for the future. So I wanted to say that in 1923, Cayuga Chief Descahe, he was of the Haudenosaunee again. So you see a link, we are finding threads, you know, through history. So Cayuga Chief Descahe, he was a traditional and spiritual chief. He traveled to Geneva as the representative of the Six Nations of the Haudenosaunee. He went to the League of Nations, that was the precursor organization of the United Nations, and he went there to plead for the cause of his people. He waited 1 year working for recognition of the League by the League of Nations, but was not received, and he came back to the United States. In a few months before his death in 1925, Chief Descahe made a speech by radio in Rochester, New York. And here is what he said. I give you an excerpt. Quote, "This is the story of the Mohawks, the story of the Oneidas, of the Cayugas." I am a Cayuga, he said. "Of the Onondagas, the Senegas, and the Tuscaroras. They are the Iroquois, Six Nations. Tell it to those who have not been listening. Maybe I will be stopped from telling it, but if I am prevented from telling it over, as I hope I do, the story will not be lost. I have already told it to thousands of listeners in Europe. It has gone into the records where your children can find it. When I may be dead or be in jail for daring to tell the truth, I have told this story in Switzerland. They have free speech in Little Switzerland. One can tell the truth over there in public, even if it is uncomfortable for some great people. I am the speaker of the Six Nations, the oldest League of Nations now existing. It is a league which is still alive and intends as best it can to defend the rights of the Iroquois to live under their own lands, in their own little countries now left to them, to worship their great spirit in their own way, and to enjoy the rights which are as surely theirs as the white man's rights are his own." Unquote. A similar journey was made by a Maori religious leader and political leader, Ratana was his name. He decided to protest the breaking of the Treaty of Waitangi, which had been concluded by the British Crown with the Maori in New Zealand, in Aotearoa, New Zealand, in 1840, and that gave Maori ownership of their lands. So Ratana first traveled to London with a large delegation to petition King George, but he was denied access. He then sent part of his delegation to Geneva, to the League of Nations, and arrived there later himself in 1925, but was also denied access. And a piece of information, a woman was part of the Maori delegation. I found it from descendants of Ratana, and her name was Hineaka Tioke. She was part of the Maori delegation that went to Geneva in 1924. So I'm giving you this introduction because this shows that the history of indigenous peoples knocking at the door of the institutions of the international community of nations is old. Indigenous peoples' sense of themselves as sovereign nations, in parity with other nations of the world, has always been very strong. The fact that states, the colonizing powers, concluded treaties with many indigenous peoples is a testimony that indigenous peoples were viewed as sovereign, not only by themselves, but also by those who actually invented international law, the states, right? So what I want to point out today are three main things: how and why indigenous peoples' issues became internationalized after the Second World War. Second, how did the characteristics of this internationalization change over time in the last 60 years, and why? What have been the main issues? And three, what circumstances gave rise to the international indigenous peoples movement, and what was the role of human rights in that? And first of all, what are the issues? Because of course, something does not become internationalized or nationalized unless there are issues to solve, right? Because there are problems. So indigenous peoples are estimated to number more than 476.6 million. 476.6 million. They represent 6.2% of the world's population in about 90 countries. It's also estimated that they represent as many as 5,000 different indigenous cultures, and the indigenous peoples of the world therefore account for most of the world's cultural diversity, even though they constitute a numerical minority. They occupy 22% of the land and are responsible for 80% of the Earth's biodiversity. The situation of indigenous peoples in many parts of the world continues to be critical. For example, it's usually estimated that there are between 6,000 and 7,000 oral and written languages in our world, and the great majority of these languages are spoken by indigenous peoples, more than 4,000 actually, and they are in great danger of becoming extinct. About 90% of all existing languages may become extinct within the next 100 years. One can therefore imagine what this percentage means for indigenous languages. Indigenous peoples also face systematic discrimination and exclusion from political and economic power. They continue to be overrepresented among the poorest, the illiterate, the destitute. For example, although indigenous peoples are 6.2% of the world's population, they represent at least 15% of the world's poor. Even in developed countries, indigenous peoples consistently lag behind the non-indigenous population in terms of most indicators of well-being. They live shorter lives, have poorer health care and education, and they have higher unemployment rates. For example, an Aboriginal child born in Australia today can expect to die almost 20 years earlier than his non-native compatriot. Coming to the US Department of Justice did a study on violence against women and found that more in 1 in 3 American Indian and Alaska Native women will be raped during her lifetime. A comparable figure for the US as a whole is less than 1 in 5. Indigenous peoples are displaced by wars and environmental exploitation or so-called development projects. the weapon of rape and sexual humiliation is also turned against Indigenous women for the ethnic cleansing and demoralization of their communities. This is happening, for example, as we speak, in the Chittagong Hill Tracts of Bangladesh, with impunity. And in more modern versions of market exploitation, Indigenous people see their traditional knowledge marketed and patented without their consent and without any sharing of benefits. And one of the biggest shortcomings today in human rights protection is that a trend, a phenomenon that we see, that states penalize and criminalize social protest activities that affect Indigenous leaders and Indigenous organizations. Last but not least, the endless hunger that has our dominant development paradigm for natural resources leads to continuous land grabbing and exploitation of Indigenous lands by corporations, especially by extractive industries. And this deprives Indigenous communities of their basic livelihood and leads to further violence and marginalization. Now, who are the Indigenous peoples? I would like to please ask again our FIMI colleagues to put up again the PowerPoint, and this time go to a text that I have given, the written text. I want to say after Mrs. Shenandoah, next one, please. So the first thing to say immediately, as you probably know already, thank you, is that there is no formal legal international definition of Indigenous peoples. I have to say immediately that there are no formal international legal definitions of other very important terms. For example, the term peoples is not defined, the term minorities, the term family, term terrorism, and yet a lot of policy work takes place nationally and internationally about this. Also, Indigenous peoples ask the UN not to define the term. This is very important for us to remember. Why did they ask that? They said that the colonizers and the oppressive states have always wanted to define us, to tell us who we are not, to say that we are extinct or whatever. So we don't want the UN to do the same kind of thing. We know who we are. And then smiling, they say, and states know who we are. So I just wanted to give this background. I was also there listening to these debates in the early 1980s and throughout the 80s, actually. So, however, we have an understanding of the term, a practical understanding, it's not a formal definition, which has been included in the famous study on the problem of discrimination against Indigenous populations. I'll tell you its background in a second. So it says here that Indigenous communities, peoples and nations are those which, having a historical continuity with pre-invasion and pre-colonial societies that developed on their territories, consider themselves distinct. Listen to this important underlining. Consider themselves distinct from other sectors of societies now prevailing in those territories or parts of them. They form at present non-dominant sectors of society. So they, in other words, they have been marginalized, right? They are non-dominant sectors of society and are determined to preserve, develop, and transmit to future generations their ancestral territories and ethnic identity as the basis of their continued existence as peoples in accordance with their own cultural patterns, social institutions, and legal systems. So again, pay attention to this. they are determined to preserve, develop, and transmit to future generations. In other words, it is the awareness and self-identification and political determination, political and cultural, obviously, of the people themselves. Okay? And self-identification is a fundamental characteristic of calling somebody indigenous. And at a personal level, a person that self-identifies as indigenous and is also accepted by the group as part of the group. And if we look also at all the documentation, some of it I have put in your bibliography, it exists. You have all these elements. I want to add something. We can take off now this paper, this PowerPoint. So I want to say that indigenous peoples stressed that it's not only the blue water principle that makes people indigenous, meaning it's not just, you know, European descent people or European powers that went into other continents that makes indigeneity, so to speak. But it can also be people from their own you know, continents, from, let's say, Asia or Africa, that you know, have created this marginalization and discrimination, and therefore indigeneity is also part of those other continents and situations, even if it has not come only from Western European, you know, states, colonial states. I want to divide the time. I want to make a distinction with minorities. This is a big deal that often, you know, creates a lot of debates. What are minorities? What are, and indigenous people said in very strong terms. They said, we are distinct from minorities. And they said, first of all, they said, we are majorities in some countries. For example, take Bolivia, Guatemala. Or we are majorities in our traditional territories. And I want to add that minorities have been viewed internationally as different political and legal categories. If you look, my friends, at the Declaration on the Rights of Persons Belonging to National, Ethnic, Religious, or Linguistic Minorities, you will see it has 9 articles. Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, 46 articles. And there is 2 fundamental differences. One is that there has never been a global minorities movement, but there has been and still exists, and it's strong and sustainable, a global indigenous peoples movement. And if you compare the 2 texts, it's not just the length, the minorities one 9 articles and our declaration 46, it has 2 major things that are missing from minorities in terms of recognition of rights. One, the right to self-determination. And 2, right to lands, territories, and resources. Close this chapter. We can talk more if you like a bit later, okay? So now I'm going to present to you the walking of the movement through the decades. And I see 2 periods in the movement, 2 periods we can distinguish in how the international movement walked the international sphere and what it did. The first one, the first period, is characterized you know, from in modern times, meaning from 45, like 1945. And it goes to 1993. And it's about the building of the first international institutional and normative foundations for indigenous peoples. That's the first period. And then from 1993 today to today is the second period, and it's about establishing specific international monitoring mechanisms and programs for indigenous peoples so that their realities can change for the better. So going to the first period, we start with 1957. That is a very important moment when the International Labour Organization adopted the first treaty, the Convention number 107 on indigenous populations. And why did it do that, ILO? Because it did a study, having heard a lot of accusations about slavery-like conditions affecting indigenous peoples in labor, right? So therefore it did a study, and indeed it was confirmed that indigenous peoples were suffering these slavery-like conditions. And for that reason, it finally, after the study, adopted the convention. And it's important for us to remember that it's based on these concepts, which were very strong already, of course, since the 19th century, the anti-slavery issues, that convinced states to finally adopt the first instrument, treaty on indigenous people. This treaty was profoundly critiqued later as the indigenous movement walked and became internationalized itself. It accused ILO Convention 107 as being assimilationist, and it actually managed to convince states and the ILO to create another instrument, which was ILO Convention 169 in 1989 on indigenous and tribal populations, peoples and peoples. It used the word peoples on the title, which was not assimilationist, and it was much broader in terms of recognition of rights. But now going back, after 57, we go to 72, and 1972 is another moment you have to keep in mind, because it was a moment that after indigenous peoples had been sending complaints and accusations to the human rights system of the UN about killings and sufferings happening to them, then a human rights body decided to do a study on the problem of discrimination against indigenous populations. This was the title of the study. And the body that decided it was the Subcommission on Prevention of Discrimination and Protection of Minorities. And at that time, the 70s, guys, that's why you see that the 70s have been so fertile also for the indigenous movement. Why? Because this was the decade of decolonization. It was the decade that saw the creation of new states after decolonization. It was also a time that saw many social justice movements, some of them based on Marxism, others not, but there was a lot of movement. And the third big ideological current was civil rights movement. And Native Americans, who also connected with the civil rights movement, had a big contribution in the beginnings of the international indigenous peoples movement. And so this study made a major first exception. Remember the word exception, because we have to wonder, why would states that are the bosses, so-called, at the UN, why would they accept exceptions for indigenous peoples that would be good for indigenous peoples? Okay, but what happened? What was the exception? The exception was that my later mentor, the late Augusto Williamson Diaz, Don Augusto, as we called him with a lot of affection, he understood that the indigenous movement, as it was just starting, it could not just give a lot of documentation, it was not possible. So he had to create a certain acceptance that this study would take time, would be a little bit delayed, because we had to, wait for indigenous peoples to be able to give that. And he convinced the system to allow 37 monographs, case studies to be done, in other words, case studies to be done, so that he could collect the information of the case studies and then bring out the elements in the study and the voices of indigenous peoples. This was totally unprecedented, and this made the study the longest study and the one that took the longest to complete, and it's also the most voluminous study. It finished in 1982, and they started publishing it in 1982. And then 1977 was a very important moment where a lot of regional and national indigenous organizations were meeting, were creating themselves. And 77, by the way, in the World Council of Churches Second Congress, World Council of Indigenous People Second Congress that took place in Kiruna, Sweden, it included a statement of indigenous women. That's where we see in the movement a clear voice. But of course, we saw the women. The women have been there from the very beginning, no doubt about that. And 77 was where I showed you the photographs, the historic photographs from. It was when indigenous people decided to meet in Geneva, as many as could come, and meet among themselves and speak historic words and imagine a future. And they started doing their strategies already then about how they would do that internationally. And then as we walk the years, we go to 1982. The study finished on the problem of discrimination against indigenous populations. And it gave birth also to the first body that dealt with indigenous rights at the UN Working Group on Indigenous Populations, 1982. It was composed of 5 experts. None of them were indigenous. Those were not the years, that this was possible. Politically, it was the beginnings, There were 5 members. And in 1983, something unprecedented happened. And that's why I share this, because I learned it. I was young like you, but I experienced it as a young person. I was in those rooms. And what happened in 83? What happened was that the working group allowed indigenous peoples directly to participate in the working group, because the rules of the UN were and are that in order to participate in a UN meeting, specific UN meetings, you have to be an NGO, a non-governmental organization, in consultative status with the UN, with Economic and Social Council. But indigenous peoples were not NGOs, and they're not NGOs. They come, they have some NGOs today, but and FIMI is an NGO, for example, but indigenous peoples, they were coming, their own, representing their own communities, their own governments, their own governance systems. And so 83, the working group allowed their direct participation. And again, I want to let you ask yourself the question, why did states allow that? They allowed it. There were a couple of them, like Brazil and Peru, that spoke harshly, and they said, oh, this is illegal, we can close down this working group. Well, they didn't. And this created the situation that you see also today. If you manage to come to the UN, to the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, for instance, that from about 25 people that you could see in 1982 in the working group, today you see in the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues more than 1,000, 1,500 sometimes people attending the meetings. And it is this direct participation that allowed that. So, and not only that, but in 84, we walk the years, I just mentioned the most important things. In 84, the UN created the Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples, which actually funds the participation of representatives of Indigenous peoples to come to the Indigenous related and other relevant meetings at the United Nations. And in 1992, there was a very important presence of Indigenous peoples at the Environment Conference, Environment and Development in Rio. And they made their visibility very much felt. 1993, again, a significant year, the Working Group on Indigenous Populations finished the draft declaration, what was the draft declaration on the rights of Indigenous peoples, and pushed it up to its parent bodies. It reached the Commission on Human Rights. And in 93, we also had the International Year of the World's Indigenous People. At the time, they didn't put the S to peoples, it was people. And Rigoberta Menchú Tam was appointed by the Secretary General of the UN as the Goodwill Ambassador for the year. And also in 1993, we had the World Conference on Human Rights in Vienna, which after this conference, there was the big push to establish the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. So this is the end of the first period. And now, as we move from after that to today, to contemporary times, we see that first of all, the UN established a special rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous peoples, 2001, so that he or she can supervise, can monitor the situation of Indigenous peoples based on Indigenous peoples' communications and based on country visits. And today's special rapporteur is Francisco Calizay Maya from Guatemala. Other mechanisms that were created were, of course, the year 2000, the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, a unique body. It has, again, another exception. Remember the word exception? Its membership, 16 people, 8 nominated by states and 8 nominated by Indigenous organizations. We are going to have a special session on the forum, so I will not go deeply into that, but also its mandate has spread, not just human rights, but of course human rights, but environment, development, health, education as well. And in 2007, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was finally adopted after 25 years of preparation. And in 2008, the Human Rights Council, the new body at that time, decided to establish the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous people as part of the Human Rights Council. So, because the UN Working Group on Indigenous Populations, this original one, had closed down by then. So now we have the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples that does studies and provides policy advice based on studies, but also provides advice to states after they request it. And just to mention 3 more gems and achievements of the Indigenous movement, 2014 World Conference on Indigenous peoples at the United Nations. Next, 2019 International Year of Indigenous Languages, amazing. And now from 2022 to 2032, the decade of Indigenous languages. All these are achievements. They are very difficult to get. no, other groups don't get these achievements, but they got them. So I will stop here for a second to see if there are any sisters that want to make a comment or a question, and then I complete my presentation, the last part of it. Sisters, feel free to, you raise your hand, or I don't know, you do something. This is, you know, how do we call it? It's a seminar atmosphere, so it's informal. So feel free to share thoughts and questions.
Any questions or comments?
If not, I can complete this part and go to the women's part, Winnie. I don't know what you think. And so after this part, we stop again for questions, comments, and then we speak about the women, which will be the women that will make the session. So.
Yeah, that's fine. In case anyone has a question that comes up or a comment, you can always write it on the chat, and then we'll talk about it after.
Okay. I want to make just a few comments about the declaration, because we are going to take time to discuss the three columns, the three foundations of the declaration: right to self-determination, right to lands, territories, and resources, and cultural rights. But I wanted to say that there were two main difficulties in preparing the declaration. There is our sister Elizabeth Olvera. Dice toda la información. Mi pregunta es, ¿cómo desde la Naciones Unidas?
My question is, how from the United Nations, how the United Nations conceives the autonomy of indigenous peoples?
And it has to do, of course, it's part of the right to self-determination. It's just one expression of the right to self-determination. And you will have a wonderful presenter. I don't want to go as deep into that now, dear Elizabeth. Allow me to say that the two most difficult questions that delayed the adoption of the declaration was the right to self-determination and the right to lands, territories, and resources. And of course, they are also interlinked. If you look at the declaration, it has many articles that are related to the right to self-determination and many articles that relate to the right to lands, territories, and resources. And we also say that, you know, the declaration, the adoption of the declaration after so long and being really a negotiation between states and indigenous peoples had political, legal, moral, symbolic implications. Symbolic and moral because after, you know, these centuries of injustice, states finally, you know, adopt a very strong declaration on the rights of indigenous people. So that has a moral value for sure. And indigenous peoples felt that. And I was in the room when it was adopted, the 13th of September, 2007. But it also has political implications. It is the basis, it is a living document, the declaration. It is the basis for negotiations and for resetting the relationship, you know, between the state and indigenous peoples. And sometimes, you know what we say, it's reestablishing the state. Reestablishing the state in a way that it will finally include the indigenous peoples instead of putting them in the margins of society. So I just wanted to share this. And also I wanted to say that basically it outlaws discrimination in various ways. It doesn't create new rights. It just says, it interprets what the other, we have already several human rights treaties, many human rights treaties, and it says, it gives detail what they mean for indigenous peoples. And I wanted also to flag what were the important concepts, my sisters, that indigenous peoples brought in to the debates, to the human rights debates, but also general international law debates. And these concepts were that, first of all, collective rights are part of human rights when it comes to indigenous peoples, because unless we recognize some rights of the collectivity, then the individual for sure will not be respected. Of course, the declaration does not only recognize collective rights, but also individual rights, and it says it in various articles. So that was the first concept, that collective rights can also be human rights. And this was a very big red flag for Western countries, Second thing they contributed is that land rights in particular are collective rights. And that was very strange for the people, the diplomats that were there, because it was the private property concept that was there in their minds, right? And they couldn't understand the value of collective land rights, what it means for indigenous people. The third point was that self-determination is also indigenous people's rights, because they have their own governance systems, and they explained them at great length. That was the third point. Fourth point, spiritual rights. It is the only human rights instrument that mentions spiritual rights. Our declaration is. And last but not least, cultural rights. It's a lot of articles, 17 of the 46 articles are linked to cultural rights. So, and it is the boldest recognition, not only of ethnicity, but also of cultural rights in international law. So I wanted to flag these points, because we are going to have specific seminars for each of the other, for the right to self-determination and autonomy, our sister Elizabeth, and we'll have, one on lands, territories and resources, and on cultural rights. So I would like our friends from Phoebe to put put up the PowerPoint again, and the 4 final pictures, the colorful pictures that I have, because my question now is, are there any good examples? Next, after this one, yes. So I wanted to show something, some positive things that happened. For example, here you see the Permanent Forum having its pre-sessional meeting in Beijing at the invitation of the Chinese government. And I present it as a positive example, because of course it is important for a big country like this to give importance enough to the Permanent Forum and invite the forum for its pre-sessional meeting. And as we speak, sisters, the forum is in Colombia, in South America, having its pre-sessional meeting. Next picture, please. Here we see this amazing opportunity we had. It was 2009, and the special topic was again Indigenous women. And you see, of course, our Indigenous sisters and an amazing event that took place. They had put together a ceremony, and we had also the Deputy Secretary General, whose black dress, you see, she had come down, and at that on that occasion, we heard words from one of the great granddaughters of Descahe. I'm going to talk to you about it. Next photograph. This is 2008, I believe. It was Bolivia that had invited the Permanent Forum for a precessional meeting. Bolivia at that time had Evo Morales as president, the first indigenous president. But what is interesting here is that when we were received at the ceremonial room of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the opening ceremony was given by indigenous elders. And I was thinking as I was seeing that, you know, that for centuries, or okay, let's say at least many decades since the 19th century, I doubt that many indigenous persons had found themselves in the ceremonial room of the foreign ministry. And this time they were leading, of course, the ceremony, and they were very present, of course. Next and last photograph. Okay, this is for me a very, how can I say, another inspiring photograph. It's from 2010, when the New Zealand government was going to announce that they finally have changed their negative vote of the declaration in 2007. Because, you know, we had 4 negative votes, right? Canada, US, Australia, and New Zealand. But all of them have been reversed now. And so 2010, the Minister of Maori Affairs, who is the gentleman stepping, holding a green folder over there on the steps, so he was called to speak. And all of a sudden, instead of just the minister going up to speak, a whole group of Aotearoa New Zealand people stepped in and did a traditional entrance dance and song, singing in Maori, both indigenous and non-indigenous. And it was a very moving and strong, because it was not a cultural event. It was very political and formal event. And the fact that it was the whole government of Aotearoa New Zealand that was, you know, wanted to do that was very moving for me. And it was very educational for everybody. So we can remove now, we finished with these PowerPoint elements. And I want to say that, yes, there are good examples around the world. For example, Greenland is the most self-determined indigenous territory in the world, based on very exemplary, to a large extent, not perfect, negotiations with Denmark. In various courts, in various countries, land rights of indigenous peoples have been recognized by national courts, including in this country, for instance. Or you have in Canada, for example, Nunavut was recognized as an indigenous, also ruled, governed territory. Also, the Maori in New Zealand have managed to obtain control of 40% of the fisheries, as we have been informed. In Belize, just another example, the Supreme Court, based on our declaration, has recognized land rights of indigenous peoples. Then if we move to regional courts, the African Court on Human and People's Rights has issued some very good decisions. For example, the Ogiek decision is the first ruling of the African Court on Human and People's Rights in favor of indigenous people's land rights. In Latin America, we have had constitutional reforms that recognize that states are multicultural, for example, in Ecuador and Guatemala, or of course Bolivia. Bolivia saw also the first indigenous president. Indigenous languages have been recognized formally in constitutions, and in Latin America we count about 17 countries that have, at least on paper or as policy, bilingual intercultural education. A number of countries have also issued apologies, starting with Norway in 1996. It was not perfect, it doesn't mean they're perfect, but we have apologies. We have, in 2008, you saw many recognitions. For example, Canada, regarding boarding schools. Japan recognized the Ainu people as the indigenous people of Japan. In 2010, El Salvador apologized to the indigenous people of the country. 2010, the least known apology by the US. It's not very well known, but yes, they did it. And 2016, an apology by Taiwan. My last three questions, and I leave them with you. What has been the role of human rights discourses in this internationalization? And what created this indigenous international identity? Okay, so the first thing to say is that human rights really wakes up states because it's a so-called sensitive issue. Why is it sensitive? Because it critiques the behavior of states based on quite high norms, standards, like our declaration. So states feel, defensive in that sense. And so, but it wakes them up. So when you bring issues under the human rights agenda, they are going to get some attention, or more attention than if you bring them up as social issues. And for example, the indigenous peoples realized that, and the women's movement realized that a little bit later, and pushed for the agenda of women's rights under human rights as well. But the indigenous peoples did it, and this created this, it has a special edge and creates political profile. Slowly, the creation of, as indigenous people started coming, again and again to the international meetings at the Working Group on Indigenous Populations in Geneva, they were creating also their own regional meetings and so on, strategy meetings. That's how slowly a global indigenous identity was created. And the word indigenous was used because there were other synonyms, right? It was discussed at the beginning. Oh, we can call this Aboriginal, we can call it First Nations, of course. And they said, okay, everybody, we have to decide one word because we need to use it. We need some practicality. And they said, okay, indigenous. And it became a proud term under which people identified themselves. So the UN became, the international level, through the human rights door, became both a way of channeling their complaints for indigenous peoples, channeling their complaints, but also articulating their aspirations for the future as indigenous peoples. And also, there were two academic disciplines that have accompanied indigenous peoples in particular. One is international law, and specifically international human rights law, and the other has been anthropology. So you have seen, academics from these disciplines accompanying and attending the meetings, participating in the meetings. What was the change over time? At the beginning, in the 80s, until the beginning of the 90s, there was a kind of, let me use the word, humanitarian feeling on the part of states they saw it, they saw the indigenous peoples uh, as cultures in the process of extinguishment, of assimilation. So they felt a little softness, you know, and they allowed some exceptions. For example, on the participation that I told you about, that now has become a rule, a customary rule about indigenous participation. But this softness, so-called, stopped. I would call it that it basically diminished by the end of the 90s, because it became clear, especially through Latin America, struggles through a lot of not just Latin America, you know, a lot of conflicts that were states understood that if they did not deal with indigenous issues, they wouldn't have a good a good state, meaning they would have a messy state, a bad economy, and things like that. And of course, a very bad political profile internationally. So, and of course, we had the movement of the Zapatistas in Mexico. And by 95, 96, you know, everybody had another feeling about the indigenous politically coming from Latin America. And there were whispers in the corridors of the UN that after apartheid and our struggles against apartheid in Africa, the next big issue will be that of the indigenous peoples. Just to tell you what a high political profile already by the end of the 90s, indigenous peoples issues had acquired. So today, by the time has changed states into being a bit more difficult vis-a-vis indigenous peoples, because also indigenous peoples are strong, they are visibly stronger, they have a lot of solidarity people with them that are not indigenous, you know, organizations or individuals, etc. And so states are more difficult today. In conclusion, before I come to women, and then it is you have the floor, achievements, number one, in large terms, you know, first of all, a global awareness of indigenous peoples' concerns and a recognition of indigenous peoples' human rights. Two, recognition and appreciation of indigenous peoples' invaluable contributions to humanity, to humanity's cultural diversity and heritage, also through their traditional knowledge. A lot of this comes through, you know, through traditional knowledge, and including also in climate change discussions. And thirdly, an awareness of the imperative, of the must, that in order to address effectively indigenous peoples' issues, we need laws, policies, and budgets. We need all that. And what is our biggest now, you know, challenge? I let you think about it, you know, but I think basically two, it's the criminalization of indigenous movements, you know, criminalization. And the second is precisely the tensions because of the resources that are digged, you know, are sought for on indigenous people's lands. So I want to finish on a positive level, this first part. Then we talk together about women's contributions. And I want to say that in 2009, in the spring, when I was still in the Secretariat of the Permanent Forum, I received an email from a great-granddaughter of Chief Deskahen. And she had been following the developments and the work of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous issues. So we invited her to speak, to say a few words at the ceremonial opening that I showed you the photograph, right, 2009. And among other things, she said, and I want to quote, she said, "My name is Kim Morph, and I'm here today to give thanks to those who have made the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues possible. On behalf of my great-grandfather, Levi General, better known as Chief Teskahe of the Haudenosaunee, I commend the forum. Chief Teskahe was determined to preserve the treaty rights of the Haudenosaunee. He believed in the spirit of Geneva and felt the League of Nations was the venue to give voice to the smaller nations of the world. I give thanks to the nations of Estonia, Ireland, Panama, Persia, and the Netherlands, who all supported my great-grandfather in Geneva in the League of Nations on his quest for peace and recognition of indigenous political independence. My great-grandfather would have been very proud to know that this forum exists so that we have a voice to express our concerns." Close parenthesis. And you know, I wanted to say and finish that in 2011, I met another great-granddaughter of Teskahe, Carla General. She's a lawyer, and at that time she was a lawyer with the Indian Law Resource Center. And of course, this is just one of the many signs that the Indigenous Peoples Movement continues. So I want to pause here in a big way for us to have reflections, take a few minutes, reflections, questions, and then devote some specific remarks that I have and you have on the contributions of the Indigenous women to all this, which was big and continues to be very big. So we open it now, Winnie. Yeah, for everybody.
Thank you so much, Professor. So anyone who has a question or comment and they'd like to ask or give a comment, please, this is the time to do so. And just to share that every time I hear about the history of Indigenous peoples coming into the UN and appreciating how far we've come, when every time you talk about it, it's like a new experience all over again, and just being appreciative of all the work that has been put in by the people who came before us. I mean, I imagine that Chief Tuskegee didn't imagine he went there for the Haudenosaunee, but all of us are we've gained from that bold step that he took at that time. I mean, he probably had no idea how many other Indigenous peoples are out there in the world, but what he did has impacted us even now, hundreds of years later. And so it's always just also just a reflection of the work that we do is not just for us or our community, it also affects very many other people in different ways. And so it's also a very reflective moment for me personally. So thank you again for keeping, for reminding us about our past and letting us know how we got to where we are now, that we can now talk about the UN or be involved in the UN or actually attend and speak at the UN as Indigenous peoples on behalf of our communities, on behalf of our countries, on behalf of the Indigenous peoples globally. It's because of the work that has been put in by people who didn't even know us, but put in the work. So yeah. So sisters, anyone who has a comment or a question for Professor Elsa? Anima? Yes, I can see your hand up. Please go ahead.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Elsa. I think it is just a reflection that I wanted to share because since I have joined this FINI class, I really felt, more connected today because, you explain with your personal experiences and you gave us the history from the very beginning. So it was really quite very clear, how difficult and what kind of effort, the indigenous people had to go through to reach to that level which we are right now. So I think I just want to thank you. I have no question, but it was really good for me at least. And I think for the other sister as well. Thank you again.
Anima, thank you very much for this reflection. I have to say, and also from what Winnie was saying, that it's very important for incoming generations of leaders, younger leaders that are come like you are, and you are a leader already, to know this all, and also the difficulties and how long it took, and what, how many mothers left their kids back there with the neighbor. Actually, it's true, to come and do this advocacy in order to achieve these things, and so that the young leaders, appreciate that and use them as living, we say living document, like the declaration is living document. It's not just to put it on the shelf because it's nice, and 46 articles, we use it in push for policy, we go to court with it, whatever, whatever we do in our work, or if we are educators, we use the education related, But thank you for your comment. I see Doris also.
Yes, thank you so much, Professor Elsa, for that so inspiring story. Because also me, I agree with the other sisters that hearing the struggles and all the things that our indigenous those who came before us did makes it even more important to continue the work now. I would just like to share that regarding the International Decade for Indigenous Languages, we also started an initiative here in the Philippines last year, wherein we had a national conference, wherein the goal was to actually to mainstream that initiative or that call to preserve and document indigenous languages here in the Philippines, because we have more than 100 languages here, and then many of them are indigenous languages. So even for me, as one of the organizers of that conference, it was it was a big thing to know that there were many indigenous languages that we did not even know about. So we had the second conference actually this February, wherein our goal was to invite more teachers so that they can help in the promotion of these indigenous languages in school, because one of the reasons or one of the main issues was that indigenous peoples here in the Philippines are being like bullied when they use their languages in schools. So I would just like to share that as a reflection. Thank you.
Thank you, Doris. Great. Great Teba work.
Well, Professor, I can't see any other hands raised.
At the moment, right? Okay.
Yeah.
I would like us to. Oh, I see medalist's hand up.
Okay. Go ahead, Madalist.
Sí,
Yes, Professor Elsa, thank you most of all for what you have told us. I believe that now that we are young people involved in leadership training and that we are having our capacities being built, that it's really important to know this history so that we know how to channel our work and to think about the problems that we are going through right now in our countries. So what you have taught us about is extremely important, and I think we are recognizing ourselves as young Indigenous women who have a certain work that we have to do to continue what was done before and to improve upon. Since we are young, we have the opportunity to do this. And I just want to say thank you for this, and we want to put into practice these ideals. Thank you, Medali.
A very important point that you're bringing up, because the indigenous movement knows this. So in politics, unless we push forward constantly, they will push us backward. So it's interesting. You see, we enumerated, we said all these achievements, right? This, that, decades, all this, years, and everything. And a friend of mine one day, who is an academic, non-Indigenous academic, said, but what else do they want? Okay, as an individual, he said this. And I said, well, they want this, now, trying to achieve several things. And there is also a sense politically, because the movement is very sophisticated. The leadership, the indigenous leadership is sophisticated. If you say, oh, now I have a declaration, fantastic, a rapporteur, the forum, oh, I can relax. Oh, kids, you go do something else. They will push you backwards. Or our declaration, right? Our text of our declaration. If we don't use it, if the indigenous peoples don't use it in their advocacy, oh, it's going to be forgotten. This happens to good laws, non-indigenous related. So this is a political reality, you know, it's the relation between civil society and the state. And so, because indigenous peoples are not states, right, they push forward. For example, since our sister Elizabeth was asking about autonomies, for example, now the big push, we'll talk about it later, you know, is for indigenous peoples' enhanced participation at the General Assembly of the UN and all other bodies of their interest that concern them. So they are pushing to expand what they have at the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and at the UN Expert Mechanism on Indigenous Peoples' Rights. So there is always, you know, a vision forward, and that's a very important point for us to share. As men or women, it doesn't matter, but it's a very fundamental political rule. If we don't push forward, they push us backward. If we relax, that's why also we need to have intergenerational connections, you know, in the movements, not to have generation gaps, because they will push us backward. Thank you, Medali. I wanted to ask, yes, sorry. Winnie, I wanted to ask.
No, just
yeah, I wanted to ask whether I can move to this more interactive discussion I want to have about indigenous women's contributions to this.
Yes, yes.
I do it.
Please go ahead.
Okay. Okay, my dear friends, I want to say that. I mean, just to say a sentence first, because we first say, we enumerate, what are the main issues that Indigenous women face. And then we say, yes, but Indigenous women don't see themselves as passive victims, the opposite, this. We say this. But I would like to invite you, because this is a real a human thing, and also a thing for which you will be involved in policy, in policy making, in your advocacy. What do you see as some hot issues yourselves, from your experiences as leaders, as young leaders, as upcoming leaders? What are the main issues you feel that Indigenous women, are facing? Just to mention a few things, Yeah, Anima, health and education. Anima, can you say more about it? Few sentences. Take the floor and say.
What I've seen here is like, because our Indigenous women, they do not have access to health. Mostly the Indigenous people in my place, they live in the hills, and the hospitals or the health facilities in the cities. So, they do not get that kind of facility in the rural place. So that is one issue. And in terms of education also, uh, what we have seen is that the women are not motivated to go to the schools to get education facility, unlike the male members. So it is similar to the Indigenous people also. It is the same like the, mainland people. So not much difference is what I see. Women is always suppressed, I think, even overall as well. But for Indigenous, it's like more like double the pressure.
Do you feel, may I ask you, do you experience, or is it your, how you judge this? Because this is discussed and written up as well. You feel that there is difficulty or discrimination coming from the general society and also from inside the Indigenous societies? On the education front, for example.
I think yes, because if I connect with the previous session, then we were also talking about the language. So here in my place, there is another language which is given more importance than the Indigenous language. So, the children find difficult to understand because the teachers who are teaching is from a different community, but our children are not able to speak that language. So when we're talking about connecting that with the women, then the number goes more high. So I don't know, that is what you were asking.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So because Indigenous women have been very, the one that come to the international level by now, not at the beginning. At the beginning, like in the 80s, in the early 80s, let's say, Indigenous women did not speak about their rights at the international level. Maybe in the community they did, but not at the international level, because as happens very often with women, not just the Indigenous, the women on apartheid, the Palestinian women, they put themselves a little bit in the back seat, not of the struggle, their issues. They don't tell them. They say, first we have to create, the freedom of our people, vis-a-vis the dominant society. So they don't speak too much about it. But by now, Indigenous women are very eloquent in a good way, and of course, female. For example, Indigenous women say our individual and group rights. They have to understand us, that it's both, And they're very critical when it has to do with, for example, violence against women. The issue is very strong, and they talk about the realities in their communities as well, and they take some action, some initiatives that are very moving, very strong. I have felt that. Then Juliana speaks about the history. Yeah, she says it's good to know the history of the struggles of indigenous peoples, of course. And you know, for me, Juliana, the fact that I read in the words in the last interview of Descahe before he died, he said, and if I am gone, and or when I'm gone, meaning when I die, right? The story will not be lost. It will be told. And for me, I get very moved by these things personally, but also by a historic person and a visionary like Descahe. Descahe was a visionary, for sure. So he basically tells us, he tells me and you, all of us, don't lose that history. Tell it, you know? And it's inspirational to remember it, that it didn't start yesterday, you know, from my mom, for example. No, started before. Yeah, and Lucia also mentions the history of people's struggle strengthen us in our training process. Yes, absolutely. And that's why if you go also to the website of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, we say history, and we put the story of Descahe and his photograph. We found it in the archives of the municipality of Geneva. And then we found a photograph of Ratana, and we put it because it's part of keeping the story alive and the narrative. And indigenous leaders, you know, if you look at how they did their strategies as they were moving through these systems, they wanted also to give their own narrative, and their own narrative to occupy good space, not to be deleted, not to be faded. So this is part of our training and our advocacy, you know, how we do these things so we keep the profile alive and the importance. And we have to use all kinds of media. So I want to ask, is there any other sister who wants to talk about problems, a problem that you see with Indigenous women? So we see our sister, Johnnery. Johnnery.
Hola, estoy muy agradecida.
Hello, I'm very grateful to have had this session and to have seen all of the steps that have been taken so that we can be here today on this platform speaking to one another. Each day we are reinforcing our knowledge, and I think our ancestors are happy because they're seeing the results of their efforts in us as Indigenous women, Indigenous peoples. And I just feel sincerely so thankful. This has been an emotional session for me. And I think it's important to talk about this history. If history is lost, then we lose ourselves, we lose our roots. So it's important to keep that story alive. One of the situations that Indigenous Miskito women are experiencing here in Nicaragua is discrimination. Symbolic discrimination, perhaps more than anything else, is what I am seeing. We are doing a lot of things, but there's so much more we need to do. And these instruments that FEMI is teaching us about are very important, and it's important to use these instruments to show what our reality is. The right to Indigenous territories. I think right now in our Indigenous communities, there is a lot of invasion, a lot of third parties coming in and invading our territory. And because of this, women are being raped. There are forced early marriages. And even though our government is supposed to talk about these things, we are seeing that there is not any support from the government. We do have access to free education, and we have that right. And we have the right to health care, which is free also. But in terms of emphasizing our rights that have to do with land or discrimination or sexual violence, there are so many more steps that we need to take still. So I wanted to say that, and thank you very much.
We have often had Indigenous women, important Indigenous women from Misquitas to the international level, as you know. And but you know what you say about these spaces that FIMI creates through the global school? I think they are so precious because we are, you are, we are. I am like honored to be here with you. You know, we are a group that we can express ourselves frankly. It's a closed, you know, a protected, safe space where we can share these things, which come from real life, from our real life. You know, thank you, Jonery. I see in the chat we have some other, yeah, Maria, gender-based violence and land rights. Absolutely. Very important. And I find, yeah, Indigenous women have always pushed for that. And on gender-based violence, I have seen also a development of the positions that Indigenous women take. They are more outspoken. And in 2012, the Indigenous women pushed, and we had what I consider like a brilliant, an amazing international expert group meeting on violence against Indigenous women. Amazing. I think I have put it in the bibliography. I will look again in case I haven't, because I want to share it with you. It also exists in the 6 official languages of the UN, so you can access it. So, yes. Thank you to Elizabeth, Sitali. Sitali raises the issue about the low political participation of women in the communities because of violence, because of the basis of sex. Yes, Sitali, it is so. And this is also happening to other non-Indigenous, you know, women, but it is true, the violence that prevents the women from from participating politically and having a high profile. I see Brittany's hand up. Brittany, would you like to take the floor?
Sí, hermana, buenos días. Hermana, yo
Yes,
creo
sister, good morning. I think one of the most relevant aspects that women, Indigenous women, don't have access to, especially Indigenous women, is access to justice. In the case of Peru, access to justice is discriminatory, especially for Indigenous women. For example, in case of rape, they listen less to a woman if she's indigenous. So discrimination in justice in Latin America is great. It's quite pronounced. And it's one of the major problems that we have. And because we don't have access to justice, we don't have access to a good education, to quality education, to good health, to quality healthcare. So I think that this is a serious point that we still deal with. Why also? Well, because in Peru now we're going through a social, political, and economic crisis. And the indigenous peoples themselves don't have access to justice. If they go out to protest, they are more aggressively tried without the possibility of defending themselves. So this makes all the indigenous communities more vulnerable, especially women.
Thank you, Brittany, for bringing it up. We know that because we follow situations and we know that it's complicated in Peru, what you're going through, all the community, everybody, I mean, as a country, politically. But I wanted to ask you before we leave this aside, whether this issue that you mentioned of access to justice has become, how can I say, a policy initiative or priority or of the indigenous women's organizations or of other organizations. Has there been any push to change this situation, to find ways, strategies to change that?
Yo creo que en este momento están todos
I
los
believe that at the time, all indigenous communities are taking this as a priority, especially in the basic systems, health and education at least. But I believe that often we don't realize that we don't have access to justice for real, a dignified access to justice where we're really treated fairly, not just in writing. So I think that this issue is not quite the focus yet.
Thank you, Brittany. I see also Lucia's hand up, Lucia Gomez.
Hi, good morning, dear sister. Lo que hemos visto sobre el tema de las mujeres.
Good morning, sisters. One thing that was said about access to justice by women, we have seen lack of access to information to begin with. The right to have access to information, as you have said, it's a right that we need to exercise. It's a right that allows us to then exercise other rights. But we know that information that is out there is in formats that we can't access to. They're in different languages. So as we've said in previous sessions, we have a lot of progress that we've seen in legal settings and rights for indigenous peoples, but that information has not gotten to the societies. They're in language, in English, and other languages that are not necessarily the languages that our communities speak. So that's why I want to highlight that it's so important that information actually lands in our community, especially for women, because among women, there's a huge gap with illiteracy because women didn't have access to education to begin with. So how are they going to have access to the information, which is so important to exercise other rights? We don't know our rights. So how are we going to exercise them? How are we going to face injustices? How are we going to make progress? Indigenous women don't even know much. They know they may have rights, but which ones? We've made a lot of progress through the CEDA, through other mechanisms. We've had a lot of progress, but women don't know. That's how our rights are violated. And there's corruption. We're working also on that. so that information can be culturally relevant and can be presented in a way that women especially can access it. Thank you.
Lucia, for bringing this up. And I don't know to what extent your organization have connected with other sisters, but there are initiatives of women's organizations who work with radio, a lot with radio, or with preparing information in languages for health related or for registering births, to make sure that births of children are registered, that the kids are registered. And from time to time, I must say periodically, I see media related meetings, Indigenous meetings taking place. Perhaps the Indigenous women, maybe FIMICAN at one point, or other organizations, facilitate, and for you advocates to get together and learn from some amazing initiatives. There are some good initiatives, that some communities have undertaken. I know, for example, that radio is very important, because it reaches, but also information in the indigenous languages is important, including, for example, for COVID, for the coronavirus. It has to be in languages that people understand to be meaningful. But thank you for bringing it up. Yeah. Regina's hand is up.
Yes, thank you, Professor. And we are very grateful because you've shared the history and stuff, because like Indonesia was colonized by Netherlands for 3.5 centuries, and they like erased so many history. So I think that history is very important, that we know the history of our arms and the history of our struggles and our people's struggles. So thank you so much. And I would like to, because so many of our sisters mentioned about the access of education. So I would like to share this because I think it's kind of related, because like our community has had difficult access on education also. So because it's not free, and because they don't have access to fund from the bank and stuff to send the kids to the school, because school is very expensive. So in 1999, like our organization built a credit union specifically for the people in the community, so they could help each other, they could get access to the fund. So now, like in 2023, we have like 23,000 members of the credit unions, and we send like a lot of people here like to schools, to university to get a bachelor degree. However, because we don't have like strong foundations of the cultures and stuff, like when we send people to school, because the education system in Indonesia don't really accommodate the people's the cultures and educational for our community, especially indigenous peoples. So when we send people to the school, when they come back, they don't really build their community. They are the reason why there are so many expansions of the oil pump company in our area, actually, because they are smart, they can get in touch with the company. So they start like uh making people selling their land. So I would like for our sister who really didn't get access to the education to think about it, to think the best first, like what do you need first before you get to send people to the formal education. You need to tell them that this is really important, that you know your cultural rights, you know that it is very important to protect your land, your culture and stuff before you send that, because it is really regretful for us, because we only think that we need access to the education so we can access information and stuff at a time, without thinking that it would be like boomerang, that it can attack us back. So that's what I would like to share. Thank you.
Oh, Regina, this is fantastic what you shared, because also your experiences in Indonesia about the credit unions. I have heard presentations of those, and they're very, very impressive, and the fact that you can use them. But what you raise, that when young people, indigenous people, you know, go to university and they get higher education, and then they get detached from community and its interests, you put a question mark. Why did I send my kid to do that, you know? And this is also a reason I have found, listening to people, that sometimes families, parents, don't necessarily want to send their kids to higher education because they will lose them also from the community, you know? So that's why what you said, the background that needs to happen in community education, you know, in non-formal community education is crucial, so that young people can feel continuing engagement with the community. Because it helps, for example, a community to have a lawyer, yes, but to have a lawyer who is also thinking, oh, how can I help my community with my law knowledge or with my medical, etc., you know, meaning to continue having links to the community. I think that's a very important point, Regina. Thank you for raising it. So I don't want to stop you, but as you're thinking, I just want to flag that, number one, Indigenous women from the beginning, they were there. From the earliest days of the UN Working Group on Indigenous Populations, they were there with strong voices and presences. I can say that for sure. And they participated extremely actively in the drafting of the declaration. And very important leaders came up and became also, for example, special rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples, Victoria Tauli Corpus, you know, Igorot leader from the Philippines. And she was also for 5 years chairperson of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. So, and many other indigenous women. And because dear Winnie said how to pronounce the Washiawatok name, that word, Ingrid Washiawatok was a sister that was very active. She was from the Menominee Nation in this country, in the US, and she was on a solidarity mission towards people in Colombia who were exploited by companies, you know, oil companies, and she was killed by the FARC, you know, the militia there in Colombia. And so she's like an icon that we have of, she was full of love, vision, and action, Ingrid Washiawatok. And they established, you know, a prize in her name. So that's the name, Ingrid Washiawatok, Flying Eagle Woman. It means Washiawatok, Flying Eagle Woman. So the women were very active, okay, have been very active. And then in 2004, I wanted to flag that as well. The Permanent Forum decided to have as a special theme of its session Indigenous women. Guess what? Because this is a seminar we have among ourselves, it faced some difficulty among some Indigenous men to, you know, whether we should have this as a special theme. But I have to tell you that after that, little difficulty, the presence of Indigenous women was so strong, so inspiring. It was strong in numbers and in quality. Fantastic. That Indigenous women are certainly a power presence at the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. I want to say that. And as I walk the years, to also say that 2005 was a very important moment, because it was a an anniversary year of the Beijing conference on women, right? And at that time, thanks to FIMI, and of course other people working together, about 50 and more Indigenous women came to New York and participated at the debates at the Commission on the Status of Women. And in 2005, for this reason, the Commission on the Status of Women that meets this week and next week, actually, in New York, they adopted in 2005 the first ever resolution on Indigenous women. And it was really a moment I want to flag as well of rapprochement, going closer between the global women's movement and the Indigenous women's movement, was coming closer together. And in 2012, there was a very good other resolution adopted. Again, FIMI was at the forefront, and other important Indigenous sisters together, you know, at the Commission on the Status of Women, they adopted a fantastic resolution called Indigenous Women, Key Actors in Poverty and Hunger Eradication. It was a very good moment. And as you know, we had the good and the great recent good moment, thanks again to Indigenous women's advocacy, in November last year, November 22, that finally CEDAW, the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, adopted general recommendation on Indigenous women, which is fantastic and a wonderful tool of work for all of us. I have read of course, the whole thing. It's 24 pages or so. And again, it's available in all the languages, or the UN's languages, I mean the 6. So I really recommend it as a tool because it's recent and we have to make it a living document. We have to use it in our work. And I also want to say that even in 1995, I want to go back for a second. In 1995 in Beijing, at the Beijing Conference on Women, indeed, some Indigenous women were there. But the issue is that they felt a bit marginalized, and that the feminist movement, so-called, the other women that were, you know, very strong forward in the feminist women's movement, they were not understanding. They did not understand when Indigenous women were saying, we have individual and collective rights. So there was a narrow-mindedness, if I can use this word. But I feel that this has become better now. There is more connection in terms of concepts now. Yeah. So although in 1995 Indigenous women were few and felt they were not listened to, by today I feel that the presence of the voices of Indigenous women by now, for example, at the Commission on the Status of Women, CSW, and at CEDAW, Indigenous women have a voice today. And we have to continue using it. I mean, because Indigenous women's advocacy created the space. We created the policy, the general recommendation of CEDAW. So we now have to use it, you know, in the advocacy. So I wanted to share that. Because all of you are linked to FIMI, I just want to say something that sounds like a joke. Of course, I was following, you know, the elections to the membership of the Permanent Forum when I was in the Secretariat of the Permanent Forum. And we had a couple of women from Latin America at that time as candidates for the Permanent Forum. And they were so strong, and of course supported by FIMI and so on, that they were called the FIMI candidates. they are so, and it was said, you know, by the diplomat, oh, these female candidates, you know, are irresistible, you know, they're going to win. There's no way they're not going to win. So I'm just giving you, you know, a feedback of the profile. This is a feedback of the political profile of Indigenous women leaders. And of course, FEMI is very important in this leadership. So I'm going to stop here and ask you to share some thoughts, questions, thoughts also in terms of achievements, the positives that you have seen, you know, based on your advocacy or other Indigenous women's advocacy that you're familiar with in your country, in your region, or internationally, whatever you want to touch upon. It's good to share good examples because we learn, you know, we learn from each other.
Buenos días, buenas tardes y buenas noches.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you, Professor Elsa, for all of the information that you've shared with us. It's so exciting to know the history, and at the same time, it's a great responsibility for all of that, for all of us connected here today, because this is how we're going to honor the memory, the work, the advocacy that great men and women leaders have done throughout decades, and also the boldness with which they opened doors and the path without losing the essence and the spirit of Indigenous peoples. So now we know how and when things, how things were changed, for example, from people to peoples, perhaps just an S, but of such great importance. So thank you, Professor Elsa. We continue to invite participants to make comments, give their opinion, ask questions. And as we've shared before, we cannot ask for something that we don't know about. We cannot depend on things that we don't really know about. So this is the great challenge that I see. How do we bring this information to the communities? If our countries have ratified,
de los derechos de los pueblos
for
indígenas,
example, the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, how do we bring this to the local communities when the resources, the lands, the territories are being taken? That's the biggest struggle. So how do we get to know this information as women, as peoples? Because right now we are drafting also our advocacy plans. It's true, we've always said how to bring the reality of the communities to the global arena. So we're just a step, right, for that reality to get there. But we're also going to facilitate somehow that all of that information from the top comes to our territories. When Professor Elsa today mentioned the contributions by women throughout all this history, we realized that, for example, in Guatemala, we've had several sisters, several women who've opened that path for us. But I think that the challenge as well is how to create those intergenerational groups, intergenerational links, so that the information doesn't stop and continues to flow through the generations. That's where we see perhaps the bottleneck. How do we continue to articulate everything through generations? So that would be the great challenge. So again, this is my invitation to all of you. We now have our last 30 minutes to participate. Please, let's do that. Let's contribute and give our opinions and comments. Everything that we can share over these last 30 minutes would be so important. And we're here to listen to you. We also have the right to be wrong. So don't be afraid about that. We are here to talk about our ideas, our thoughts. There's no wrong, no right. And we invite our women leaders to share.
Hortensia, ¿puedo decir algo? Qué placer verte. Que las
Hortensia, I would like to say something. The indigenous women of Guatemala have done so much to follow up on these struggles and to provide information and create movements. You actually create movements. To access to justice, for example, there's a professor who's going to speak to our group here, Melacaya from Bolivia. She talks a lot about the women from the indigenous movement in Guatemala, about everything that you all have done and the profound strength that you transmit to society on the side of the community, as you say, next to the community, with the community. The question is always, how do we take this to the community? You do that, and it's admirable. So that's why sharing good examples and ideas among yourselves these days is a wonderful thing to do. Thank you so much, Professor Elsa. And I think the challenge continues to be there, forming intergenerational spaces to be able to transmit information and guarantee the continuity of processes. The work that is done needs to be continued. So we want to see more hands up here. So share your experiences about the importance of knowing the history of our struggles and how we demand our rights as peoples and as indigenous women. Lucia, go ahead. Thank you, Sister Hortensia. In terms of the information, we do work on access to information and cultural knowledge and learning about our rights. We think it's a right of citizens to know what the government is doing as well in terms of budgets, public programs, interpreter. So if they don't provide information, how can we educate others? What we're doing currently is asking for institutions to provide reports that are culturally competent and that they translate reports in an accessible way. That's the only way we can find out what they're doing, and as a community to pressure for improvements. And if they don't do it, it's a violation of our rights, because access to justice and when the rights of Indigenous women are violated in terms of our access to health and education, it's hard to move without proper information. So we demand information about what is being done in our communities and territories. And then we can make our own contribution about how the budgets are formulated, and we can get more participation. And we can advocate in all of these processes. I think our voices need to be at the table for all of these issues and to get information out to all our communities. To do so, we have radios that talk about health issues, that talk about violence issues. But we are very sure that information is a right that we have as peoples and as women. We need the right information to be able to exercise our rights. Thank you. Thank you, Lucia. The experience of the implementation of Lucia's advocacy plan is interesting as well. Lucia, I would invite you to turn your results into an alternative report that can be used at this time. And that's another way that we can show how the state is violating the rights of Indigenous peoples, denying access to education in the budgets even. So with the correct data and the monitoring that you've been doing of the national budget, there's a lot of things that can be done. So we want to encourage women to challenge the system and to realize that changes can be made by getting involved in different spaces. And where budgets are being determined, we really need to be around that table as well as Indigenous women and Indigenous peoples. But we often have to challenge the system to be able to do that, as well as the demonization of the participation of women in public institutions. These are just comments and analyses that we make so that we can challenge each other to step up and to work in various spaces. Is there anyone else who would like to take the floor? We still have about 22 minutes left that we could take advantage of. Anima, thank you for raising your hand, and you have the floor.
Thank you again. Professor Elsa have shared about how Indigenous women were there from the very beginning, but somehow they felt at times marginalized, especially, I think I've heard it correctly, when the feminist movement was at par or when they began. So uh, now, because I come from a small place and where we women don't know about UN. I mean, it's like a new term, for many of us here. So I am quite fortunate that UN is not very new term for me, but this platform, of course, is new for me as well. So now, I'm sharing the similar experience, whatever I learned from here. I'm sharing this with our women folk here from the Indigenous community. And it's something very surprisingly new for them. So, when the other sister was talking about the right to information, so I was, this thoughts just triggered in my mind that if uh, a very few people know about how the UN function or how we can actually be a voice. We have to be a group, to be a voice and reach out to that international level. So, one thing that, just came to my mind is probably the sharing of words to each other. That is a source of information, not to that level but even to the community level. So when we talk about data or any kind of information, I think the last time we also spoke about how Indigenous women have to take active part in collecting information, data, facts, which will be useful as a weapon for any advocacy plan. So I think these are, for me, I think these are pieces of information which I can probably collect from my Indigenous community, the Indigenous women from the rural, apart from the government data that we are also talking about. So I think I'm just referring that this also is a piece of information, I believe, when we reach out to our own people, the women community, and get their validation that this are happening on the ground, and somehow match with the information which is probably not very easily accessible, but we can keep trying, that's all. But then comparison of the information. So I think that's what I wanted to share in terms of information.
Gracias, Anima. Profesora Elsa.
Thank you, Anima. Professor Elsa? Yes, I just wanted to say that
to the issue of data collection. It is extremely important, and it is, we say also, data disaggregation is a human rights matter, because only if you disaggregate data, you can see the real image, the real situation. For example, for Indigenous women and girls, you have to disaggregate data of the community, or etc. So I wanted to say that this work, if you do it with your community, it's important for your community first of all, but it's important to give it as much publicity as you can, vis-a-vis, of course, state institutions that deal with education, with health, whatever, it's very important. And also to share with UN bodies. We are going to have a seminar separately, just me and your group, about how you can use UN human rights mechanisms to submit complaints if you wish, but data is such an important piece of information, and it takes a lot of work to do, that you can, by itself, it's very telling. You can submit it to human rights treaty bodies when your country's report is coming up, or you can send it to one of the human rights special rapporteurs that are relevant to the issue you want to raise, depending what the issue is. So I just wanted to stress the importance of data. There is also one more thing. There's the so-called Indigenous Navigator. Do you know it? Anima, Indigenous Navigator. If you put capital I, capital N, and you Google it, you will see it's a tool that has been created after a lot of work between indigenous organizations, and also they were helped by a Danish Institute for Human Rights. Anyway, it took a long time, but it is a way for indigenous community, it's a tool of how indigenous communities themselves can monitor their situation. So it's a tool for indigenous peoples to use. Look it up, maybe, since you are doing this, collection, disaggregation of data, it can be very useful, I suggest. Yes, Joy put the link to the Indigenous Navigator in the chat. Thank you, Joy.
Gracias, profesora. Elizabeth también está pidiendo la palabra.
Thank you. Elizabeth also wants to speak. You have the floor. Hello, good morning to all of you. Sorry, but I hope I can make myself understood. I wanted to ask you also that with this data that you mentioned, that often government officials are the only ones that collect data, But if we do our own assessments and we have our own methodology, this can be important information too, even if it's not recognized as official data. I think for us, this is very important to place our information out there and to make it visible through various platforms. From our experience here in Mexico, we participate in the shadow report of the CER Commission, the Commission of the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And we took out our own data and assessment, and we put in something very important in terms of access to justice. We put racial discrimination on the table, analyzing one of the articles of our criminal code. And it was really important to make this visible because you could see how institutions give less importance to certain kinds of justice. There's almost a dual justice system. And so most of us Indigenous women want to have access to justice, and inside our own peoples, our powers are limited because the state has put certain constraints on being able to do anything. The state also violates human rights, and this makes it hard for women to protect ourselves against violence. There are human rights violations that are happening, and in our assessment, we realize that people aren't going to report these violations because they don't know how to do it. They don't know what office of the government that they should go to. So all of this has me thinking that maybe it would be good to continue taking these initiatives to generate our own data with our own studies and our own methodology in our own territories. Thank you, Elizabeth. Would anyone else like to ask a question or make a comment?
Bueno, mientras.
All right, then.
Profesora Elsa,
We'll give you the
sister for raising this, because these are, just to answer your last point, Elizabeth, that you asked the question, I think these are, they are not state, they are not created by the state statistics office, but they're very important to use in the human rights bodies. They're very, because you will do it seriously with your experts, with your time that you will spend with your interviews, etc. You will have a methodology in order to put statistics together, and I think they would be very useful for all these bodies, not just for CERD, but whenever you see, for example, any of the other human rights bodies that are relevant to Indigenous women. Of course, they are relevant to Indigenous women. You can present them there. And I would say, as an idea, Elizabeth, also of sharing experiences, it would be fantastic if if, for example, your organization comes, let's say, to a session of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, for you to create an important special event where you can also share your experience and how you did it with the others, because you can inspire other organizations, to do this. Because and the Indigenous Navigator, which is this huge initiative, came from these deep needs and convictions of people like you. how important it is for indigenous peoples to collect their own information and do their own analysis.
Gracias, profesora Elsa. ¿Alguien más?
Thank you, Professor Elsa. Would anyone else like to share some comment with us? If there is no more participation, Professor Elsa will give you a few minutes to close up the session, and then we will close out for the day.
So I'm saying goodbye, right, Hortensia? Should I say goodbye?
Sí, por favor. Sí, para cerrar esta
Yes,
sesión.
please, or just close out the session.
No era para que se fuera, sino que para
We
cerrar.
weren't trying to get her to leave. We were trying to get her to close the session. But thank you to all of you. As FEMI, we are wanting to continue to invite you to participate actively and proactively during these sessions. We are also monitoring your participation and your interventions. There are some selection criteria for the advocacy plans and their approval afterwards. The level of responsibility that you take is important. As we said at the beginning, 80% of the assessment is based on your participation. And I'd like to reflect with you on the need to come in punctually to our sessions. Sometimes we are very concerned because our invited guests are here on time. However, as participants, you are coming in a little bit later. Sometimes we have to start with only 5 or 6 participants, and you have the whole FEMI team here. We have all of the interpreters and the technical assistants, but the most important participants, who are you, are not here yet. And so please come in on time so that we can channel this leadership that you have. You were chosen from a whole list of women leaders, and your participation is extremely important. These are the footprints that you're leaving behind. So I want to leave that reflection with you, and I hope that we can continue making progress on our advocacy plans and to strengthen the work of the declaration of each region. Each region has its own dynamic. Each region has its own realities, but we have so much in common. So we have just a few minutes more, and I don't know if for my FEMI colleagues, we have a few minutes left, and if you would like to say anything, please go ahead. I just want to emphasize the need to strengthen our participation.
Thank you, Sister Lucia. Thank you, sisters, for being here today. I would just like to add on to what Sister Orte was saying. I think it's very important that we read before the class, especially for the classes with Columbia University. We've shared I would just like to remind you about the bibliographies that had already been shared earlier of Columbia University, and it's also uploaded in the G drive that we had shared with you. Please go through the readings anytime you're free. Just make 20-30 minutes time to read. I remember Professor Elsa used to tell us, you cannot be a good advocate if you don't read. A part of being an advocate is to read, and write. So I encourage you to please read before the sessions so that we can make these discussions more interactive. Like today we have some time with Professor Elsa, so we can also just go a little bit off topic as well. If we read, we can just say, I read this article written by so and so person. I have a few questions on this. Would you like to spare 5 minutes to just clarify my doubt or to explain a little bit more? So I think let's take this opportunity and read. So that's all from my end. I don't know if Vinny have anything else to share.
Thank you, Joy, and thank you, Arthur. No, not really, but I'm just reminding everyone to please work on your statement as well, because the permanent forum is quickly approaching. And so if well, I know we're in different regions, but just to encourage you to keep working on your statements as well. As especially on the days that you don't have sessions, please work on your statements, because those are also important. And as Orthe said, to start to work on your advocacy plans. We had a session on advocacy plans, and so it's important to also connect some of the things that you're learning here to your advocacy plan. How are the things that you're learning now in these sessions enriching your advocacy plan, or going to enrich your advocacy in your own community? So some of these lessons are not just for these sessions, they're supposed to help you in the work that you're doing. And so again, interaction is very important. Please participate. Just, you don't have to have a question, but I'm sure that someone has that you have an example, you've had an experience. So any of those that you're supposed to be talking about in class, so that you also encourage the people who come to speak to you, because I know it's very disheartening when you speak and no one speaks back, or no one responds to any of your questions. It's very disheartening for the person who's talking. So please ask any question, make a comment, give an example, because all of you have had different experiences really in your own communities and in your own homes through the work that you're doing. So please share those experiences, and you can also relate them to what the person talking about during their presentation, so that other people can also make actual connections. Like someone today said, "Thank you so much, Professor Elsa, because you shared your experience, so it was more relatable because it was real." So when you share your experiences, it makes whatever it is that is being talked about more real, because now someone says, "Well, this is what happened to me in relation to what you're talking to." So please think about that when you're participating, because at the end of the day, these sessions are for you. They're supposed to increase your knowledge, to increase your capacity. It's supposed to be helpful to all of us, really. And then, because even the people speaking also learn from you. They learn from your experiences. They learn from the work that you're doing. So please share those. So yeah, thank you so much.
Gracias, Winnie. Gracias, Joy. También, mientras mencionaba la hermana.
Thank you, Winnie and Joy. You were mentioning Professor Elsa. Imagine how old she was when the first thing happened at the United Nations that she told us about today. And now we are having the opportunity to hear from her firsthand. She has now been working on these issues for several decades, and she's keeping the story alive. So without further ado, thank you very much to each one of you. And I wish you a great weekend. Hope you enjoy some time with your family and with everything you have to do. Don't forget your homework. And we will be sure to have good results in the work that we're doing. Let's rest some then, and we'll see you on Monday. And if you need anything, we are certainly available to be contacted. Good weekend to all of you.